Hello, dear friends. It's time again to probably meet for the last time upon the issue and the book What is Zen? Plain Talk for a Beginner's Mind, which consists of an interview between the person who asks questions, Susan Moon, Sensei, and the person who asks the questions, Norman Fischer, Roshi. I think it is a wonderful book. There are many wonderful books actually around. And why do I say this? Probably it is because of the forum, the interview. I'm a fan of good interviews because, as Norman at the beginning states, you do not really know what you will be talking about. And this is what the listener and reader loves most. We love to feel the aliveness in the person who is talking, writing, in this case answering. We love to hear the whole body, and the body is more than the physical body, but it is the physical body standing or sitting on this ground. Mainly, we love to hear this. We love that the person is connected, and one might say is connected to all chakras. Is the flow? There is an energy flow that can really ignite us. And if we were kind of sleepy before, it is probable that we will really be alert and energized again when we listen to something like this, even about a subject that originally is not ours. For example, a person who's really enthusiastic about physics or just to say something, but really speaks about his or her aliveness. Why she or he has chosen such a subject to investigate or express something, many, and I belong to these, love this way of contributing to shared passion and shared insight and shared wisdom and shared enthusiasm. But here, for me, it is both. It is a subject that nourishing one of my passions, Zen, and the way it is done, even triple. Two persons here, two writers, two passions come together, and the questioner is wise enough and experienced enough to hold herself back, not interrupting, not even subtly interrupting the flow of the person who is answering, and at the same time asking questions that point into the center of the questioning and doubtful and at least sometimes and puzzled student. The last chapter, the 14th chapter of this book, is called Saving All Sentient Beings, which is our vow. And as I'm at the end of a 7-day session at Red Cedar Community with Norman Fischer and Tim Burnett and Chris Burkhardt, and we are chanting this saving all beings, more than once. I feel moved to commit my time now to this and conclude the project. A project that had started in January, and I visualize it to be finished around Easter, but it didn't work in two ways. First, it didn't work to be as interactive as I had hoped. So I thought maybe at first we would start with a silent time, then I would read, and then we would share with another what would be alive in us. This did not work, and perhaps I should have offered in another way. One will certainly reflect on this after this experience is finished, and perhaps hear some opinions of others. And the second point is that I tend to sometimes it's good, but sometimes to be too tight in visualizing projects. So I was not aware that some chapters asked to be shared in two parts. I think this happened 3 times, so three weeks more, and also I did not count in that there were weeks I would simply feel and be actually by other commitments booked out and could not find a really good place or the same place I had announced it, which was on Saturday afternoons, and then I left it totally because it doesn't make sense. If I'm the only reader, sharer, so to speak, which I still love to do, I can do it whenever I have time, actually. And now it is this time. It is this time, and I do it with more respect even as before for the two persons and teachers, and more respect for the subject, for Zen. As any endeavor, which is really, I think, of depth and worth, it has changed me. But I will not talk now about this. I will probably write, I do not know. And I will start. Saving all sentient beings. Susan, there is so much work to do about the tremendous suffering in this world. Poverty, social injustice, war, environmental destruction. Isn't it selfish to spend a lot of time just sitting and staring at the wall without helping anybody else? Norman answering. A question I ask myself every day. Most of the time I conclude that I'm not doing enough to help. Most of the time I conclude probably I can never do enough. I don't see how any of us, whether we waste our time sitting or waste it in some other ways, can overcome the uncomfortable feeling that we are living in a world full of pain, are in part responsible for that world, and are not doing nearly enough to address it. Even someone who would appear to be devoting a lifetime to alleviating suffering can't feel satisfied. I would think that he or she is doing enough. If we care about the world, we all have to live with and be grateful for this discomfort. I spoke to this in part on pages 130 to 31 when I wrote about the social relevance of monasteries as places of quiet. When we offer our silence to the world, we are offering something useful, although its form is uselessness. Another Zen contradiction. We get burned out eventually by all the important and useful things we have to take care of. To sustain our efforts over time, we have to be able to rest in uselessness. For me, uselessness is the essential characteristic of all spiritual practice. If it's spiritual practice, it must be useless. That is, it won't improve your looks, your health, your livelihood, your intelligence. It won't help the world. You do just to do it, literally uselessly. But its uselessness is exactly its usefulness. Exactly because you're not trying to get something out of it, but are doing it merely to do it, it refreshes. It changes your life. For me, a life of helping others usefully is only sustainable when I have useless spiritual practice to keep me afloat and to remind me that in the end even the useful is useless. In brackets, I would actually like to discuss it with Germans because I'm not totally resonant to it. I think we have two words that express what I think Norman is meaning. That is Absichtslosigkeit and die Nichtverwertbarkeit. And I find that this is more going to the point, but I will go on and I will make a note to it and perhaps discuss it with the teacher at some later. The Catholic tradition understands well the importance of spiritual practice as revitalization for work in the world. Some of the most inspiring social activists I know, and I include in this group caregivers, teachers and so on, have been Catholic religious people who are devoted to what they do as spiritual practice, as expressions of their faith, and who are sustained in their efforts by that faith and their spiritual practices. I'm not, of course, saying that all social activists or people in helping professions need to do spiritual practice, but I'm saying that I think it would help them if they did. In brackets, I do recognize that for many people a life of service to others is itself a spiritual path. I think that's well observed. I'm saying that serving others and practicing silent meditation are not at all mutually exclusive, as your question seems to imply. It may seem logical that if you spend time sitting, you will now be spending that time helping. But in fact, spending time sitting enhances your capacity to help and sustains it. Anyway, no one can help 24 hours a day. There has to be sleeping and eating at least. So maybe a little sitting is okay too. Another thing, sitting helps you to be more connected emotionally, and that makes your efforts to help more heartfelt and meaningful, and probably more effective. It makes you happier, more satisfied, and less frustrated doing your work, and it gives you a wide and generous view that will keep you going longer, because it doesn't really help to be desperate about the suffering world. We all need to pay attention to the world's great problems, but at the same time we need to be happy, to be capable of joy. Otherwise, how can we help anyone? For those who have shown up, I'm reading from the last and 14th chapter, Saving All Sentient Beings, from the book What is Zen? Plain Talk for a Beginner's Mind by Norman Fischer and Sue Moon. These days governments are rational and materialistic. They deal with social problems by spending money to alter things in the material world. In ancient times, governments did little more to help people than supply military might, ostensibly for public protection. But ancient governments did support religious establishment to send up prayers for the king or the emperor. This was considered a reasonable form of social spending. It ensured that God or Buddha would protect the sovereign, and that was understood to be good for everyone. These days, no government would do this, but maybe there is something to it. Maybe some social good comes from our prayers and spiritual practices in a way that our materialistic philosophy can't account for. Maybe our world isn't well served by the almost total hegemony of materialism. Maybe uselessly sitting and facing a wall, or uselessly making artworks that no one will pay money for, or uselessly feeling or thinking our lives is a way to help somehow. Next question. Over the centuries, women have gotten a raw deal in the patriarchal Zen tradition, but we have come a long way. In the West, there are probably as many women teachers as men. What do you think we still need to work on in order to have gender equality in American Zen? Yes, says Norman. We have come a long way. I'm proud of how inclusive and open the Western Zen tradition is for women and LGBT people. Our society as a whole has improved enormously in this regard, but I think the Zen movement is ahead of the curve. It hasn't always been so. I've always felt it was open and fair, but the truth is it's taken me a long time to uncover my prejudices, face them as honestly as I can, and stretch my view. It's been a long process, and I assume I'm not yet finished with it. I assume there is more to learn so that I can become more inclusive than I'm now. And I assume this goes for everyone, inside and outside the Zen movement. To some extent, inclusion has meant, okay, this is how we boys do things. We will now let you girls do things this way too. And maybe the girls at first are happy to do this. But after a while, we all discover together that the girls don't necessarily want to do things the way the boys have been doing them. And then we all do things differently together. So my guess is that we don't yet know how the world will look once we've collectively discovered what the feminine is when it's fully empowered to take its place in the world. My assumption is that we have a long way to go on this path of discovery, and that as we go along, everything, including Zen, is going to change. I assume this will be an improvement. I also assume there will be downsides and that we will lose a lot too. Next question by Sewell. In the Zen Sanghas where I have practiced or visited, the membership is overwhelmingly European American. What can those of us already practicing to do help our Zen Sanghas become more welcoming and more relevant for people of color? And before you respond, Norman, I want to acknowledge here that I'm asking about what we can call convert Sanghas, the only kind with which I'm familiar. There are many more Sanghas comprised of Americans who were born into Buddhism who are Asian immigrants or descendants of Asian immigrants and who practice in temples that follow their various cultural traditions. We Western converts to Buddhism, latecomers that we are, owe respect to these ethnic Buddhists. The answer. Yes, most Zen and other convert Buddhist Sanghas, with the exception of Soka Gakkai, a Nichiren Buddhist influenced school that is quite diverse, tend to be populated overwhelmingly by European Americans. You don't find many African Americans, Hispanic Americans, or Asian Americans. This is gradually changing, but we still have a very long way to go. It will take time. And we can't just wait. It won't happen by itself. We have to make the effort. The groups I'm aware of that have been most successful at such efforts are those that have taken on racial and cultural diversity as a central issue. In Oakland, the East Bay Meditation Center is located downtown, easily accessible by public transportation. The group's core teachers are almost all people of color, and the center was founded to provide a welcoming environment for people of color, members of the LGBTQI community, people with disabilities, and other underrepresented communities. The Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, and other centers have had designated retreats for people of color. They have supported these retreats financially, making them inexpensive or even free, and have run free buses into large cities to bring people to Barre who would otherwise not be able to come. I think it's very beautiful to hear that. I think you have to take steps like these to address the issue. Class diversity is an issue too, and most Buddhist centers are preponderantly middle class. Absolutely. Still, it is going to take a long time. When there are enough Zen and other Buddhist teachers of color who will understand how to present the teachings and the practice to serve their communities, people of color will come in larger numbers to access the teachings. When the teacher is a person of color, it will be much easier for people of color to feel as if the group is for them. And once a few people of color come, more will come. As it is now proactively inviting people of color to come to mostly white Buddhist groups, whiteness isn't just a color, it's a culture, probably can only take us so far. Still, we have to do it. This is a question not only about Buddhism. Our whole culture has this question. What is real diversity that honors and celebrates difference? I am sure that as diversity increases, so does wisdom, fairness, and goodness for all of us. We are trying to figure this out, generation by generation. Susan. The first of the 4 vows Zen practitioners take is, sentient beings are numberless. I vow to save them. This is obviously impossible no matter how hard you try. So isn't this a hypocritical vow? And who is saying this? I think she's going on. The 4 great vows chanted after Dharma talks in all Zen places. No, sorry, it is Norman now who answers this. So Susan's last question was, so isn't this a hypocritical vow? And now the answer by Norman. The 4 great vows chanted after Dharma talks in all Zen places in one translation or another are: beings are numberless. I vow to save them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. Buddha's way is unsurpassable. I vow to become it. As you say, these vows are literally impossible to uphold. Like other contradictions we have been talking about in Zen. To save an infinite number of beings is by definition impossible. The other 3 are the same. People at Zen centers chant these impossible vows all the time. Why? A person who is courageous enough to point out the obvious will bring up this question. So many of your questions are like this. You remind me of the Zen master Tung Chan, who as a young boy listening to the chanting of the Heart Sutra was puzzled when he heard no eyes, no ears, and so on. He pointed to his own ears and eyes and ears and said, then what are these? What does the sutra mean? You also remind me of the child who innocently pointed out that the emperor has no clothes. Most people are either too intimidated or too sophisticated to note the obvious. However, in this case, the emperor does have clothes. Or to be a little more accurate, the emperor's nakedness is exactly the clothing he needs. Anyway, let me try to explain. Your question is specifically about the first vow. Beings are numberless. I vow to save them. This is a vow of compassion. It expresses that at the heart of our practice, we cherish the wish to practice with a radical unselfishness, for and with others, not just some others but all others. And we vow not to rest, not to feel as if our practice is complete, until all sentient beings, infinite in number, are saved, which in this case means saved not only from oppression and outward forms of bondage, but also saved inwardly, from bondage to self. This vow expresses the understanding that liberation isn't a solitary affair. Only when all of us are saved can any one of us be saved. So this impossible vow is an expression of the infinite love we aspire to place at the very center of all our practice endeavors. This vow and the others also refer to the teachings on emptiness that are so foundational to Zen and all other schools of Mahayana Buddhism. As we have said, these teachings emphasize that there are no separate fixed entities. All things are empty of any actual separation. All things are fluid and free in their oneness and radical connection. So when we say all beings, we don't mean those other beings out there who are not us. We also mean ourselves as those beings and them as ourselves. And when we refer to beings and ourselves, we are referring to things that don't exist in the ordinary way we think of things existing, as separate entities. Taking all this into account, we might say that the vow to serve all sentient beings is also a vow to recognize that all sentient beings are already saved, because their nature is already to be free of themselves, just as we are already saved and free of ourselves. So it might not be as hard to save them as it might at first appear. I hope this explains that we are not making senseless, hypocritical vows. The contradiction in the vow, like all the other Zen contradictions we have been talking about, is a contradiction in words, but in living we have to have this contradiction, and it isn't really a contradiction. If we want to be caring, loving people, whose aspiration is to be ever more caring, we need to see that there is nothing to care for, no caring, and no one to care. Everything is always loved and cared for already in the arms of absolute compassion. All of reality is compassion itself. Being born and dying are compassion. The arising of every single thing is already compassion. Every blade of grass, every cloud in the sky is compassion. There could be nothing at all, and yet there is something, so many things, such immense and beautiful things. Seeing compassion in this wide way, so wide that it becomes a logical impossibility. If everything is nothing but compassion, then there is no compassion, is necessary in the end. Otherwise, our caring will always be limited and stingy, bound by our ideologies and preferences, and we won't be able to sustain it. Next question, and we have only 3 pages left. Zen is non-dualistic. In the realm of the Absolute, there is no difference between good and evil. Things are as they are, and the point is to be fully present in the moment. But doesn't this imply that there is no difference between killing an enemy soldier with a sword and carrying a child out of a burning house? Let's listen to Norman's answer. We have spoken about ethics and precepts before, in chapter 6. It's clear that there is a strong sense of ethics in Zen practice, and we certainly recognize the difference between killing someone and saving someone's life. We have talked about the 3 levels of precepts practice: literal, compassionate, and absolute. The absolute level referred to in your question might seem to propose that there is no difference between good and evil, but actually there is no absolute level apart from the literal and compassionate levels. Literal, compassionate, and absolute levels don't really exist separately. They are just ways of talking about one level, are actually lives in these bodies and minds in this world. We all know there is a difference between good and evil. But we notice that not everyone agrees on which is which. In brackets, though I believe that as a human family we are getting closer to unanimity on this point. Nor can we help but notice that much evil is perpetuated in the name of combating evil. We are human beings with tender hearts, which is to say we know what it is to be hurt. We are creatures who must practice ethical conduct because it's our nature to do so, literally, compassionately, absolutely, and in all other ways. In Zen precepts practice, the fundamental, absolute ground of ethics is being itself. Things just are. Life just is. And in this are or is, not being is also included. A moment of time arising is a moment of time passing. Being born is the beginning of dying. This is sad, tragic, and in the end, probably impossible for us to fully understand. Yet we can and do feel the immensity of being itself and the terror of unbeing. Grounding our lives in this fundamental truth, which is hard to appreciate and acknowledge, is the fruit of our practice. I want to write it once more. Grounding our lives in this fundamental truth, which is hard to appreciate and acknowledge, is the fruit of our practice. This is where the teaching of no difference between good and evil comes from. It's essential but can't be taken out of context. When evil is perpetrated, it becomes a fact of existence. As I write this, ISIS soldiers are beheading people in Syria and Iraq. If there is any evil in the world, this should certainly seem to be an instance of it. Yet it is still a fact. It still actually did happen. It is something that is. We have to accept that this has actually happened, and we have to somehow take it in, difficult as that may be. It is now a part of our world, of our human life. This doesn't mean we have to condone it or that we should do everything we can practically do to prevent it from happening again. It only means that we have to accept it as having happened. This acceptance is how I understand the absolute level. We accept evil as existing when it exists, just as we have to accept that a loss that's occurred to us has actually happened, even as we grieve it. If we deny or refuse to accept reality as it is, we won't be able to cope with it. We will keep on making the same mistakes again and again. Our losses, if we don't accept them, can destroy our lives. You mentioned that Zen is non-dual. I'm not sure I entirely understand the concepts of non-dual. Some years ago I was invited to make a presentation at a conference whose theme was non-dualism. I listened to many of the talks people were giving and was surprised to find that to many of the speakers, non-dual meant oneness. I guess this makes sense. Either it's dual, which means two or more, like dual headlights, or it's not dual, which means it's one, or one with a big O, as most of the speakers seem to understand it. In your question, you seem to see it that way. Good and evil as separate things would be dualism, two different things. Non-dual would mean that good and evil aren't different, they are one thing. But to me, oneness is dualism. Because if you uphold oneness, then you have oneness on the one hand and dualism on the other hand. And this seems like two different things to me. I agree with oneness, dualism is a mistake. To me, this seems like dualism. And then I think sometimes reality arrives as one, sometimes as more than one. The way I'd understand non-dualism is that it includes dualism. If non-dualism doesn't include and validate dualism, then it is dualistic. I hate to talk like this, but it just seems true to me in living. Your question is about ethics, and all this applies here exactly. Oneness would be, yes, this happened. A man was tortured to death, and yes, a child was saved from drowning. Like all that happened or ever could happen, these are true living facts, and as such, I must accept them as real, good or evil, whether I like it or not. Dualism would be wrong is wrong, and I'm committed to doing what is good and right, not what is evil or wrong. In actual living, I can't see any way but to embrace both of these ways of seeing life. How else could we live a reasonable human life? So in the last question Susan Moon is asking, the last perhaps shocking question, what good does Zen do anyway? And Norman is answering, Sue, after all these pages, how can you ask such a question? I'm not sure it does any good at all. Maybe in order to practice Zen, you have to be able to appreciate that and not mind. So thanks for listening. Thanks that this book has been written. Thanks for the enormous effort to put such a thing together for us and for many others. And perhaps you want to be informed about what's going on in Everyday Foundation, and then you can have a look at www.everydayzen.org. And I heard by my Dharma brother John Murray that the website is in the process of being totally reformed, and there are extremely many and beautiful podcasts on it to be arranged and better found. Perhaps I do not know about these things, but I think that donations for everything, but especially also for the website project, will be deeply appreciated. Curious myself when we will meet with another project.